Good morning, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking to Glenn Matthews about housing, some tips on what to look for and what to try to avoid. So I will turn this over to Glenn now, and he will talk to us about that. And please remember to save our questions till the end, and don't post anything personal in the chat, such as your WhatsApp number or email, because this will be viewable to everybody else that accesses it from our YouTube channel. Okay, so Glenn, I'm going to hand it over to you in just a second here.
Done?
You should be a host now. Yeah.
Says host disabled, participant screen sharing. Okay, so.
But now you're the host, so now if you try, it should work.
There we go. Aren't we having fun this morning? Well, welcome everybody. Happy to see everybody participate. I will start out by saying finding housing is never fun, ever. It's an arduous task and it's complicated, even more so, but for you, because you're not in the country, not even close to the province, so it becomes a little challenging. But by being here, at least you're getting some basic information to help yourself so that you don't run into problems. My office deals with students when they have landlord-tenant issues, roommate problems, and things like that. And it's easier to avoid those problems if you know up front what you need to know so that you don't have to deal with it once you're in the place. So what do I need to know? We have a 5-step process that we're recommending people look at, and often student tenants, especially if it's the first time they're going out to rent, they just jump in, like jumping into the deep end of the pool without knowing how to swim. So some things to be aware of. So do a budget, think about costs. You want to think about your roommates, think about who you're going to live with. And I'll talk about them in a minute. Really important, because if you don't like your roommates or the people you're living with, it's going to make up for a long school year. Very difficult. Then you want to think about, where am I going to get accommodations? What do I need to look for? Things like that. What kind of lease do I sign? Do I have to sign a lease? What, lots of times we get asked, why do I have to sign a 12-month lease if I'm only there 8 months? Things like that. Then you want to think about your lifestyle. It will affect what type of building you take. It'll affect, whether or not you're willing to take a bus to save a bit of money, things like that. So in the first step, under costs, you got to think about, how much money do I need? And you want to think about, what does it cost to live in London? And unfortunately, with the pandemic, not just London, but all of Ontario, the prices have skyrocketed. So you might as well know that up front. You're going to pay anywhere from $550 to $700 in a shared accommodation. So a shared apartment, shared house. And even that's getting to be a little low, because we're starting to see people charge $800 a month in a shared accommodations. Students sometimes still find $550, $600, but they're having to go farther out. You're not going to find something under $700 that's walkable to the campus, or very unlikely to find something like that. If you're an apartment, anywhere from $1,000 to $1,300, and I saw recently in some of the government surveys, 2 bedrooms were going up to $2,200 and getting pricier by the day. You want to think about, what does the rent include? Because that's a major item. Utilities, some landlords will include them, some will not. Be very careful about if internet is included, what does that mean? A landlord might give you basic internet, and you might want unlimited. It gets to be a bit of a problem, especially if there's 5 people in a house. If everybody's watching Netflix or doing major projects or things of that nature, the internet might be pretty slow if it's just basic internet. How can I reduce my rent? So you want to think about ways. So the more roommates that you have, likely the rent's going to be less if you split it out amongst you. And you're going to have to think about joint costs like cleaning supplies, toilet paper, things like that, that, is shared. Might save some money that way. You might think about jobs. Some people would prefer to live close to their part-time job because it's at night, and don't mind taking a little longer bus ride to the school to get to class. What other costs are involved? I mentioned cleaning, etc. But legally, the landlord, if you're not sharing with the owner or the owner's family, you're covered by the Ontario rental law. And typically landlords ask for first and last month's rent up front. They will typically or legally can only ask for last month's rent, but they will typically, it's industry standard to ask for first and last. You need to think about insurance, theft, fire, liability. That might cost you $400 to $600 per year. And you can get a sample budget on our website. We'll share that website with you at some point along the way. The other thing, and I'll get to guarantors in a minute, but if you're in with roommates, how well do you know them? Will your living habits work well together? We have roommate agreement on our website. The big thing you do not ever want to do is sign a joint lease with people you do not know. I mean, it's one thing to sign a lease with somebody you know and you think you'll get along, but if you sign a joint lease with people you do not know, you become liable for them. So don't sign the same document if there are people you do not know, because there's liability. You would become liable for those other people. So if they don't pay the rent, they damage the property or whatever, the landlord can make you pay part of the damages as well. The big thing about roommates and or housemates or people you're living with, you need to ask, can you talk about money? All right, lots of people don't like to talk about money, but you need to be able to do that especially for joint expenses. But there are other issues. We have a roommate agreement on our website. You want to think about bills and responsibilities of bills, but you also want to think about living habits. Is it okay to have a guest over the night before you have an exam the next day? Probably not. So you want to think about those things. The other thing which we're finding this past year, COVID. Have you got a roommate agreement that states what you will do about COVID if somebody gets it in the house? Or will you say no visitors because you don't want to potential spread of COVID in your house, etc.? So you really have to think that one through to figure out whether or not you have some issues with the COVID. So third one is accommodation. So how will I find a place, and do I want to be in a house, apartment, or room? You want to consider this site, which has off-campus housing listings. The college is in the process of changing from their in-house program to a public program called Places for Students. Places for students. And basically they have places on there of landlords that want to rent to students. Be very leery of websites that are buy and sell websites. I'm going to be honest with you. So in 2016, I surveyed every student that came to me with a problem. And that was over 350 students individually coming to me that had a problem. 100% of those students that came to me with a problem found their housing on a popular buy and sell website. I'm not saying you can't find housing on that, but it's something you need to be very leery. And we're recommending, you want to check the place out. And obviously when you're international, it becomes a little difficult. You want to have them do a live FaceTime with you, not a virtual tour, because the virtual tour could be of any place. You want a live FaceTime where you see them using a key to get in the place. You want to see the house numbers on the street. And then you want to go to Google Maps and do a street view to see what the place looks like, to make sure it is the place that they're promising. I know everybody's going to rely on the internet, but you just need to be a little leery that scams do happen on the internet. So, you know, where do I look? Where do I want to live? So you look at bus routes, you get a bus pass with your tuition. You know, you have to, are you at the main campus, a downtown campus, one of the satellite campuses, or the South Campus? You should go to ltc.com and look at the bus routes to make sure that you've got a bus that's fairly close to where you're going to live. And if you do not see a place on the Fanshawe Places for Student website, you might want to do a Google search of apartments in London, and then look along the bus routes that actually go to campus, so that you might want to contact those landlords directly, because if you find them on Google Maps, all you have to do is click on them and their contact information will pop up that you can go ahead and look at it. So what type of place do I want? An apartment. You know, if you're in an apartment, you have far less things to worry about. It's a lot easier to put garbage down a garbage chute than it is to get garbage to the curb. But a house might have a nice backyard. You want to sit out, relax and stuff like that. So just, you got to think about what your choices are with looking at that. The other thing we're going to say is have patience. Looking for housing is not fun. And I know it's hard to say have patience when the market is tight as it is right now. So you need to do all this stuff ahead of time before you even look, so that you're ready to jump on something that you're ready to do. But don't sign something, and I'll get to this in a minute. Don't sign something until you're absolutely sure. We also have accommodations checklist on our website. So if you look at 3 or 4 or 5 places, you make notes, and then you don't forget what was in a certain place before you decide on what you're going to use. Does it have everything that I need or want? I'm going to tell you, a lot of places, a lot of roommate fights are settled by having a dishwasher in the place. Some places have laundry, some do not. If they do not have laundry, where's the closest laundromat? So you want to figure out where to go to do your laundry. And if the laundry is provided in the unit or in the building, you want to know, is it free or is it pay per use, right? Apartment buildings, it's typically pay per use. In houses, it's a mix. Some are pay per use, some are free. What is the condition of the place? This is really important. You know, you walk through or look at a place, you can see with live FaceTime, does the paint look shoddy? You know, in a live FaceTime, you could ask the landlord, you know, open and close some windows, see whether or not there are things to do, need to be repaired. You know, if the landlord promises you something verbally, it's absolutely useless, absolutely useless. So you want an email confirmation from the landlord, what they will do before you move in. There's no requirement under law for the landlord to paint the place before you move in. There's no requirement under law for the landlord to clean the place before you move in. There's no requirement under law for the landlord to change locks before you move in. And if you do nothing else, try and get the locks changed, because we've had situations where previous tenants have made copies of keys, given them to their friends, and those keys never got turned in. So there's a bit of a liability sitting out there with keys to your premise that the landlord hasn't collected. You want to think about, is the place safe? London's a fairly safe place, not too much to worry about. But you want to think about the windows and door locks. You want to think about busing routes, how late at night coming back from the library or something, how close is the bus stop to the place I'm going to rent. The other thing, if you're worried about safety, like I said, London's a fairly safe city, but if you Google London police, they have a map on their website that's for crimes in London. So you can actually go to the crime map and see where do typical things happen. The only problem with that is students tend to experience higher break-ins than a lot of places because smart thieves know when students are away for holidays, etc. And they know, smart thieves know that students have small electronics, which is something thieves want desperately. But if I were to give one bit of advice about safety, the London police will tell me and various people, students often don't lock their doors, right? So people just walk right in. So if you lock your windows, close your curtains, lock your front door, you're doing 99% of the safety issues that you might want to be aware of. So be careful of that. Under Ontario law, the landlord is required to put in smoke detectors and CO2 detectors on every level of a rental and outside the sleeping areas. So that is required by law. And if they aren't there, you can call in an inspector free of charge, and they will issue an order for the landlord to provide them. Sometimes basement rooms are popular with students because generally they're a little cheaper. You need to make sure there's an escape route. There are requirements for windows to be of a certain size in the basement, and that every tenant in the basement would have access to the place. We unfortunately had a fire this past year with some international students in the house. Luckily, people walking by were able to pull 3 people out of a basement of a burning house through the window. But it's really important to make sure you have that escape route. Like I said, don't take a place sight unseen. I mentioned virtual tours here, but a better method would be live FaceTime. You know, like I said, I could do a virtual tour of a house 2,000 miles away from London and post it as if it's in London. And you're just looking at pictures and stuff. You have no idea where that house is. You do a live FaceTime and then confirm it on Google Street View, you'll have a better chance of getting the place that you're hoping for. You know, like I said, don't take it unseen, virtual tour. You want to do the live FaceTime. The other thing, you might ask the landlord for contacts of current or past tenants. The single best way, the absolute single best way to avoid a bad landlord is to ask or talk to the current or past tenants. Some landlords won't give you this information. They'll cite that it's a privacy concern or whatever. There's no law that says they can't give you that information. So if they're not willing to give you that information, you still might take the place, but you might want to, that might raise a red flag in your head that maybe the landlord hasn't had good experience with tenants, etc. You know, it's just something to consider when you're renting. So leases. So what type of lease can I get? You know, like I said, 8 months is what students want. Most landlords want a 12-month lease because they have expenses the whole year round. The bigger question for you is, does the Residential Tenancy Act apply? That's the Ontario rental law, and it requires the Ontario standard lease. All right. So if you're covered by the Residential Tenancy Act, the law will apply. The landlord should be using the Ontario standard lease. The good thing about that is if you sign a 12-month lease, but your program is more than that, you do not have to sign a new lease. You just automatically go month to month. Don't have to sign another 12 months. So what some students do, they sign a September 1 to August 31st lease, and then in the second year, they go month to month for 8 months. So they only end up paying for 20 rather than 24 months along the way. And as I said, the government, as of a few years ago, required the Ontario Standard Lease, which is on the government website. The other thing about leases, you can send them to me and I will give you feedback on the lease. We do not or cannot legally recommend a particular landlord or a particular property, but we can certainly give you feedback on whether or not the lease is acceptable, because sometimes landlords add things onto the standard lease, which is legal, legally allowed, but sometimes the clauses they add on to the lease are not legal. The good thing about if you're covered by the Residential Tenancy Act, if you sign a document that has an illegal clause in it, doesn't matter. The law will override the clause. Won't override the lease, but will override the clause. The big question, though, is does the law apply? And there are two situations where it doesn't apply. If you share a bathroom and or a kitchen with the owner or the owner's immediate family, you are not covered by the law. If you are a tenant of a tenant, you are not covered by the law. So what does that mean? It means you have no rights, none whatsoever. You have absolutely no protection under the law. That means the landlord can make up just about any rule they want, and it kind of gets to be a problem sometimes, because I'm dealing with a student last week that the landlord did not want the tenant using the bathroom after midnight because it kept them up. Well, that sometimes is not possible, but so the student continued to do it, and the landlord said, sorry, you're going to have to leave. And they can actually ask them to leave because they were sharing with the owner or the owner's immediate family. I've mentioned this or alluded to this earlier, separate leases versus a joint lease. If you do not know who you're living with, make sure it's a separate lease, not a joint lease. Because you're on a joint lease, you become liable for whoever's on the document. All right. And if you sign a lease and you think you're doing it for yourself, make sure and you should do this with any contract or legal document you sign, any blank space should have a stroke in it or an N/A, so that after you sign the document, the landlord can't go back and add things later. All right, so it's really important to do that. I mentioned guarantor earlier. Probably 50% of landlords are now requiring a guarantor, which is really difficult for international students because the landlord will want the guarantor to be in Ontario. And that's just because a guarantor guarantees that you pay for your rent or any damages, and if they're out of country, they have no method of going after that money. So they will require a guarantor. It's usually a parent or a guardian or somebody that will guarantee that you pay the money. One way around that is the landlord cannot require a deposit. If they're covered by the Residential Tenancy Act, the landlord cannot require a deposit larger than 1 month's rent. However, a tenant could say to the landlord, I'm willing to pay a larger deposit if you forgo the guarantor requirement. All right, so I'll give you an example of that. My niece just rented a place. Landlord wanted a guarantor. She paid 4 months ahead to get them to waive the guarantor aspect. Now, they have to use the money for rent. They can't hold the money and then give it to you after you leave. They have to use it for rent. So it's not like it won't be used at some point. I realize that could be difficult for some people, but it is one way around the guarantor aspect. Some landlords, especially corporate landlords, will ask for an application. And we recommend tenants be very careful about that, because some applications have a little clause in them that says, if we accept you as a tenant, you're bound by the lease. So I had a student once sign 5 applications thinking it's just an application. Well, all 5 landlords accepted that tenant. So they were stuck for 5 leases. So don't sign an application unless you're absolutely sure that you want the place. And if you think holding back a deposit means anything, no, it's if you sign something and or give a deposit, you could be held liable. And we recommend get things in writing. Like I said, no requirement to clean, no requirement to paint, no requirement to change the locks. You want to get everything in writing, even if it's not in the lease. If you get a confirmation email that says, we as a landlord agree to do the following at such and such address by such and such date. And if you really want to push the envelope, put in a little clause that said, my rent's discounted by a certain amount. Landlords may or may not do this, but if they truly are going to do it, they should be willing to discount your rent until the item is done that they say they're going to do. The other thing that happens with, and this is particular to international students, sometimes international students will pay by cash. It is the tenant's right to pay the rent by whatever method they want, as long as it's legal tender. But if you are going to pay cash, get a receipt immediately. Because if you do not, and you pay by cash, you have no proof 6 months later that the landlord won't come back to you and say, hey, you didn't pay this month's rent. You argue, I paid cash. Landlord says, got a receipt? And if you don't, it's problematic. And I tell people, even if it's on toilet paper, get something in writing that says you paid so much rent for rent at such and such place in the amount of such and such for whatever month. You want to get something in writing, especially when it's cash. How do I prove I have a lease? Landlord under RTA, they must give you a copy within 21 days of signing. So the landlord is required to do that. If you're not covered by the RTA, I would strongly suggest get a copy of it right when you sign it. All right, so you want proof that there's something that's been done. Like I said, get immediate receipts. How do I know the lease is okay? So that's where you send it to me and we'll give you feedback to ensure that it's the proper lease or whatever. I mean, if it's not RTA, I'm not sure how much I can tell you other than landlord can put anything in that document they want. But it's probably more important to have a document when you're not covered by the RTA, because you want to know things about personal habits, cleaning, dishes in the sink, laundry. Some landlords say you can only do laundry on Sundays, or you can't do it after a certain time at night, things like that. So it's important to have something in writing to ensure. The one thing I will say to you, and this is why I say be very careful before you sign anything. It is very difficult, very, very difficult to get out of a lease under the RTA. It's a little easier when you're not covered by the RTA, but even then it's still a contract. There are 3 methods under the RTA to get out of the document. But again, if you really need to do it, contact me, but don't go in. Like some people will sign a 12-month lease with the full intent to leave after 8 months. I don't recommend that. You might be able to get out of it, but I don't recommend it. but up to you on how you do it, but it's really difficult. So lifestyle. How do I know the rules when living with people? Like I said, we recommend doing an agreement related to chores, dividing a cleaning schedule, friends partner over. Like some people have a partner over every night of the week, and sometimes that starts bugging the roommates because maybe they're paying the utilities and they're thinking, this guy's not paying for utilities. Why shouldn't they be paying for part of the water, the electricity, the heat, things like that? Smoking's a big issue. Making a rule about smoking outside or something of that nature is probably better. You need to be aware of city bylaws related to noise, garbage, parking. So in the city of London, noise bylaws 24/7. Some places it's after 11 o'clock at night, but London, I've seen students get tickets at 10 a.m. So you need to be aware that if noise emanates from your unit, it's a chargeable offense. Or the landlord, if it's bothering other tenants, the landlord might consider eviction. Garbage, London has a funny, this is why a apartment might be easier. London has an 8-day schedule, which means garbage is not the same day every week as most municipalities in Canada are. And there are some parking rules. If you have a vehicle, you need to make sure you've got parking because during the winter, you can't leave the vehicle on the street. So what are landlords required to do once you're in the place? We strongly recommend the first thing you do when you move in, take pictures and record any maintenance issues and give a written copy to your landlord and keep a written copy. Because you want to be able to verify that when you leave, anything that's not working or was damaged or whatever, there may be things that you don't care about. But you want to make sure the landlord doesn't come back at you when you leave and say, well, you did that. And you say, no, I've got proof it was here when I moved in. So take pictures when you move in. Take the last thing you do when you move out, take pictures. Some students will take basement bedrooms, and windows are required in all bedrooms. Windows are required, or screens are required between June 15th and September 15th. And as I said, all bedrooms must have windows. And in the basement, they have to be of a certain size. That's required. They have to be big enough so you can get out of there. And I mentioned this earlier, smoke and seal detectors are required. Some people ask, is a fire extinguisher required? And no, it's not. I personally have always had a fire extinguisher just for my own safety, but they are not required. What is the landlord required to provide? So heat must be 20 degrees during the day and 18 at night. Now, if you're paying for the utilities, it's up to you to set the thermostat to meet those requirements. But if utilities are included, these are the minimum temperatures that a landlord is required to provide. And I'm going to tell you, 18 at night, I couldn't live. That would be too cold for me. So 18 at night in the middle of winter, it's going to be cold. So you need to think about if utilities are not included, the landlord hits 18 at night, that's all they're required to do. So you need to talk to them and make sure. You might even negotiate something better than that. Landlord is required to provide hot and cold water. They can shut it off for a couple hours if they're doing maintenance, etc., in case there's some issues, but they can't use it as a strategy to make you pay your rent. So if you owe money to the landlord, they can't say, if you don't pay, I'm going to shut off the water. That's illegal. Cannot do that. And you can call the city inspector in and they would be required to put it back on. Same thing for electricity. Landlord is required to provide electricity. However, if you are paying the electrical bill as for the utilities and you don't pay the bill, the utility company can shut the electricity off. Landlord can't, but the electrical company can if you don't pay your bill. Landlords are required to remove bugs and rodents by law, and that's whether you're covered under the RTA or not. And the only way they can pass any bill along to you about bug or rodent removal is if you caused the problem. So as an example, we've had students put a year's worth of garbage in a garage. That's obviously going to attract squirrels, rats, mice, all kinds of things. We've had students put a year's worth of empty beer bottles in the kitchen corner. Stale beer attracts cockroaches. So in those scenarios, the landlord could pay a company to remove them, and you would be stuck with the bill. Where they cannot do that, though, is they can't just do it themselves and bill you. They have to show you a receipt of a bill they paid for a cleaning company to come and do it. They just can't say, well, it took 3 hours of my time, I'm going to bill you. Can't do that. That's not legal. All right. So, and if you're in a house on separate leases, they can't just divide the bill by however many people are in the house. They have to be able to show who caused the problem and give the bill to that person. You know, like I mentioned at the top, I know looking for housing is an arduous task. It's a pain. And even people in Ontario find it challenging. And we've done surveys of students, and often they'll take the first place they look at. And that might be okay, but I tell students, you don't take the first cell phone you look at. You do a little bit of comparison shopping. You do a little bit of looking around. And I realize with the market, the way it is, it becomes challenging. But I'm going to tell you, the worst thing you want is to be stuck in a place that by the end of September, you hate it, and you're stuck there till next April. You're just going to regret doing that. You're going to dread coming home from class every day because you don't like the landlord, you don't like your roommates. It's all going to be challenging along the way. So here's the website I mentioned that you might want to look at some of your resources along the way. You might want to email me if you've got a lease that you want looked at or find things. Students will contact me for references, like for a landlord or where to look or whatever. We are not allowed to recommend a particular landlord or a particular property. What I will say, though, is if you are coming with a family, I will give you a list of where families have typically rented in the past. You know, this is generally like 3-bedroom places that are really meant for families, etc., not for individual students. But again, that's for families, mostly because our website doesn't cater to families very well, and it's more for single individual students along the way, or a group of individual single students that would help with that. So, and with that, I'm going to leave it for questions that anybody might have.
Thank you, Glenn. And the power is back on here. So I was able to plug in the laptop.
So I put you back as co-host.
Oh, perfect.
Okay. So any questions in the chat? Not seeing.
There was a question for splitting bills. What is the most common app used in Canada?
Sorry, the what?
Like an app for splitting the bills.
Honestly, I've never heard of one. There probably is one because there's thousands of apps that are coming out every day, but I've not heard of one. But usually what I recommend with splitting the bills Like typically, somebody's going to have to give their name to a company. So do not make somebody the house treasurer to pay all the bills. So what you might do is one student takes on the electrical bill, one student takes on the internet bill, one student takes on the hydro. And then what you do is settle up the differences so that if somebody takes on all the bills, if you have one student that's not paying their bills, there's 4 or 5 bills they're not getting paid. If you separate it out, if that person doesn't pay you, then you don't pay them. So you kind of split it out.
Was there any other questions for Glenn? I see there's a bus pass question, and it's just that, so your bus pass is for the full academic year plus the 4 months of the summer. So your bus pass will be active from September until the following August. So during your co-op, your bus pass would be valid if you had started in September.
Yeah, I can't stress enough, why make your life more difficult? Try and get on a bus route. In January, you don't want to be standing at a bus stop too long, and you don't want to have a 3-block walk to the bus because it'll be cold. The other thing is you might look for the express buses. So Oxford has an express bus. So you might want to look along Oxford because there are more buses that come in. There is a slower bus, I think it's 17. But there is an express bus which brings people to the campus far faster, but there are fewer stops for the express bus. So you don't want to get caught in between the express spots and have to walk 3 blocks. And I guess I would stress the market is tight in London. But if you go outside the traditional student areas, a lot of people want to be walking distance to campus. I get it. It's better. But a lot of walking areas, it's 10 or 15 minutes. Well, you can take a 10 or 15-minute bus ride, and you're more likely to find housing that's available.
So questions related to residents are probably best asked for residents, but at this time, residents does have a pretty long wait list. So we are letting students know that residents is not likely to be an option for you unless you were already applied and already been approved.
Yeah.
Was there any other off-campus housing questions? It looks like there's a question just asking if you have a list of the best zones to live.
They're not really best zones. Again, I would do a Google search on Google Maps for where the college is, and then you can look around. But the best advice is to go to ltc.com and find out the bus routes into campus. So I mentioned Oxford. There are a couple of buses that come in from the northwest area of Huron and Highbury. So there's housing out there as well that come directly into campus. It's more important to find bus routes that come into campus than any particular zone. I mentioned about the crime map. Most of the areas around the college are relatively safe, but I mean, London's a big city of 400,000. So there's going to be crime. But, thankfully, London's pretty good as a city with regards to crime. Other than, like I said, students can be a target because of small electronics. But if you take even the minimums of steps, like locking your door, which I don't understand why, but students sometimes don't lock their front door. It's often when another tenant has lost a key. So rather than produce or pay to have another key produced or whatever, they just leave the door unlocked, which I don't understand.
There is a question there on shared accommodations. What would rent likely look like near the South Campus?
The South Campus is a little challenging because there is not a rental market for students totally developed because it's fairly new. There are apartment buildings reasonably close by on Bradley or Wilkins, Sandringham, that are, you can catch the Wellington bus down from Sandringham. But a lot of students that are in the South Campus, there is an express bus that goes to the South Campus down Richmond and Wellington. So a lot of students will rent downtown or even at Oxford and Richmond, because they can either take an express bus to main campus if they need to, or an express bus to the South Campus. And there's more options in the Richmond, Oxford area than there is at the South Campus.
Thank you. And there's just a question here about the bus pass. And yes, you can use your bus pass to travel anywhere within London. So the bus pass will work any time of day on any bus route. It doesn't have to be coming to and from classes.
And sometimes people will ask, well, when do buses stop running? Different routes vary, but on the more popular routes, it's usually around midnight. So the Oxford is one of the busiest bus routes in the city. That and Richmond, Wellington are the busiest routes. Typically it's midnight. So if you need to be in a lab or somewhere on campus after midnight, you either might have to depend on a friend or Uber or a cab to get home and stuff like that. So, or just make sure you're out of there before the buses stop running.
Perfect. So if there's no more questions, then we will wrap it up for today. Thank you so much, Glenn. It's always so great for our students to have access to your resources and your vast knowledge.
Happy to help. Hope everybody has a good year. And email me, like I said, email me if you have a lease that you want feedback.
Perfect. Thank you. And good night. Good day, everybody. And hopefully we'll see you all back Monday. Monday, we are going to be talking to Kim from More Care. So about your health plan.
Take care.
Bye. Take care, everybody.